Good evening.
Are you comfortable?
No.
I've been teasing that the first question I ask will be his waist size, but I'm not going to do that.
My waist size is bigger than it ought to be.
So Colin Robert Johnson is indeed retiring at the end of 2018. That means passing on to others his work as the Anglican Archbishop of Toronto, as the Metropolitan of the Ecclesiastical Province of Ontario, and also as Archbishop of Moosonee. But somebody said to me the other day, is there actually such a thing as retired clergy? I think those who enter ordained ministry don't generally do so in order to become CEOs. They do it because they love God and they love people. And there is much love and intelligence and commitment in Archbishop Johnson's life. He and Ellen have been married for 42 years.
And counting.
They are a strong and true team. They have joyfully raised 3 children, Andrea, who's married to Brad, Rachel, and Timothy with Kit. They are grandparents to Kira and Zoe. Colin's own family of origin has strong family roots in the small Ontario town of Mount Forest. As was mentioned, he was raised there in the United Church tradition, and he has journeyed to become Archbishop in the largest Anglican diocese in North America. That's true, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, he said modestly, there are many stories. And to begin, I'm thinking that life after seems almost unimaginable. Is there one small thing that you are looking forward to? And I'm just thinking in my case, which was so regimented by time, to have a coffee at 10:30 in the morning and finish it was wonderful. Is there a small thing you're looking forward to?
There are 2 small things. One is I look forward to actually sleeping in and perhaps not putting on my clothes until noon. And the other is to actually have some time and go for ballroom dancing lessons with my wife. Although, as she knows, our chancellor told me that Ellen does not have enough insurance.
Yeah, I don't think that's a small thing. So let's begin by setting the scene of your childhood. Where did you grow up? Tell us about the town, the neighborhood.
Mount Forest at the time I was growing up was about between 2,800 and 3,200. The school I went to, the high school, had 325 students. I was raised in the apartment on Main Street of Mount Forest, in one of the apartments above my father's store. My grandparents owned the building, and they lived in one of the apartments. My aunt and uncle lived in another apartment. We lived in another apartment, and this wonderful, crazy woman who was the Jewish owner of the women's clothing store lived in the other apartment. And it was a building that was built in about 1850s. It was a former old hotel, so it had huge 12-foot ceilings and big rooms and landings, and it was a crazy place that you could run around and play and do hide and seek and build forts and ride your tricycle down the stairs.
And your dad sold men's clothing?
My father sold men's clothing. My mother assisted him in the store. She did some of the alteration. She was also shopkeeper with him, and those were my first jobs too.
So this was a small Ontario town, classic Main Street, shops on both sides, and everybody knew everybody?
Everybody knew everybody. My brother will correct anything I say.
Or not.
He was younger, so he actually didn't know. But everybody knew everybody. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents had lived in town. We have 4 or 5 generations buried in the town cemetery. I was related to 4 or 5 or 6 kids in my class. I used to say that my girlfriend at the time, if I wasn't related to one of the people in town, she was related. And often we were related to the same people.
So tell me a little bit about the legacy of your parents for you.
My parents were, my parents and grandparents on both sides. And I had my grandparents alive until I was in, all of my grandparents were alive until I was in first year of seminary. So it was really quite wonderful. Second year of seminary, as a matter of fact. And they were highly engaged in the community. My father was a businessman, but so was my grandfather. And they were engaged in the community activities and the clubs.
But what did they give you that you carry on?
Well, my father was a politician. Should I say more? And he took leadership and eventually became the mayor of the town and then a member of provincial parliament. And for 15 years served as an MPP. And the two things that came out of that, I think, for me, was that sense of taking leadership and responsibility. But the other is that real compassionate care for people. He was the old-fashioned constituency man, and he answered telephone calls in the middle of the night. Crazy phone calls, like, my basement's flooded, what are you going to do about it?
You've
Nothing.
probably had some like that, actually.
Yes.
And what about your mom?
And my mom often was somewhat in the background in those things, but she had leadership roles too. Leadership certainly in the family, but she was more partisanly political than my father was, actually. She would phone up and tell people that they needed to vote for him.
So your parents knew what they believed in and they knew what they wanted.
They did, and they were deeply engaged in for other people. There was a story that my brother would certainly know that there was a tiny little office at the back of the store, and a customer would come in, and my mother would go out, and eventually come back to sit in the office, and my father said, "So, did you get their whole life story?" Well, they were just talking. Yes,
so
she
a
had.
real interest in people.
Real
for
interest
sure.
in people.
So try to be as impartial and as honest as you can be. Tell me what 10-year-old Colin Johnson was like.
I was nerdy.
Nerdy.
Nerdy, yeah. I love books. Interesting little story. When I was in grade 2, I went to the library, and we had a librarian who was sort of ogre-like. And it's a little Carnegie library, that dot the province. And I borrowed a book. Her name was Mrs. Butts, I remember. And she had scoliosis. And I took the book out. And then about a year later, I realized I'd not taken the book back, and it said 5 cents a day overdue fine, and I began to calculate what that was, and realized I could never take that book back. And in fact, I never went to the library again until I was about 10, and we had a project at school, and I had to go to the library. And I took a deep breath, and I went into the library, and there was a new librarian.
Things have a way of working out.
They do. And then I began to read, and I read and read and read. Science fiction stories.
But nerdy, what does that mean?
I wasn't into sports particularly, track and field, but not into typical sports. I was a terrible skater. My grandmother decided that she wanted me to be a hockey player and bought me all the equipment. And I did it for the year because I had to, and then I didn't do it ever again.
And did church play a larger or smaller role?
Church played a large part. I sang in the choir, junior choir. Small towns, you think small churches, right? No, we had a big church. This was the 50s. Everybody went to church. So we would have 300, 400 people in church. We had a junior choir of 45.
And you liked it?
And I loved it. I loved the music. It reached in and grabbed something in me that was quite splendid. And we had very good music, professionally trained people. It was a great experience.
So music is one of those themes through your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That actually was what attracted me to the Anglican Church.
Now, I recall you saying that you took a larger interest in church than your friends.
Yes, I actually went. They did too, but I went willingly, and they didn't.
Did it
And
set
I
you apart?
engaged in all sorts of things. And so when I came to confirmation at 12 or something like that, I actually took it really very seriously. And
this
took
would
part
be
in youth group and all sorts of things
In
like
the
that.
United Church, the
In the United
confirmation.
Church, and then I joined, my voice changed early, and I joined the senior choir. And of course, then I had to go to church every Sunday, all the time. Like when I was a kid, we did the United Church thing. We went to church most of the times, at least some of the time. My grandparents were very faithful. Actually, interestingly, my grandfather, one grandfather, and the other grandmother went to church really regularly, and the other two grandparents went when they had to.
That's a really great context for
So
your
it's
work.
great context. So, but I went to church every Sunday, or just about every Sunday. When I was in Sunday school, I never, ever won that award that was for perfect attendance. I didn't even understand how anybody could win such an award. And I actually hated Sunday school.
Oh dear.
I liked church. I was interested in what the adults were doing, and I wasn't actually interested in Sunday school.
Now, another theme in your life that people may not know is that you are quite conscious of the effect that some strong women have played in your life. And I know that there are quite a few. So tell me about 2 or 3 of those people, and we're going to talk about Ellen later.
There have been a number of very strong women, and I grew up in a family that there was never any question of that men were strong and women weren't. It was a very equal basis. My parents functioned quite equally. They didn't do the same things, but power was equal. My one grandmother was quite ferocious. In fact, both grandmothers were quite ferocious. So I grew up with not any sense of the distinction that male female meant strong weak. One of my best friend from kindergarten, and we became lab partners in physics in university. So it was intended that we were going to get married when I was in grade 5. It would have been totally disastrous. She became a roommate of Ellen in university. But we were equals. We were competitors, major competitors, academically, in all sorts of things. And her grandmother eventually lived in the apartment building, the apartment next to ours. And she came home for lunch to her grandmother's every day, and the two of us had lunch in 47 seconds and then played board games. And we had arranged to have the board games with, we would be able to play 2 full board games in lunchtime because we changed the rules.
Another good experience for your work.
Yes, yes, yes.
Another woman who was strong?
In high school, I had a mentor, Judy Maddren, who was the math teacher, one of the math teachers. She was exactly the same age as my mother. Her husband, Ken, was a year older than my father. Everybody knew everybody else. But Judy had the capacity to draw people together, and she would have what you would, in sort of elaborate terms, we'd never use that term in Mount Forest, but she would have a salon sort of in her homeroom. And people would just gather and talk and have conversation about the most amazing range of subjects. And she wouldn't even propose the topic. She would just sit there and let us talk as teenagers. It was a marvelous experience. And she introduced me to arts and the city, and not in a way that could possibly be done today, unfortunately. I mean, there are problems on both sides, but it was a relationship that enriched me and gave me an experience of the world that could not have been possible in the small town that I grew up in.
And as a teenager. Exchange of ideas as a teenager is not usually happen.
And so I spent a lot of time there. She became almost a second mother. And I ended up going to university, and when I chose the courses for university, one of the things she said is, you will not have a well-rounded university course unless you take at least one course in philosophy. So I took one course in philosophy and discovered I loved it, but what are you going to do with philosophy? And I also studied math and economics and chemistry and physics. And
so this is University of Western Ontario, when
yeah.
you discovered your calling to the ministry.
I did.
Can you give us that short story?
Well, in the summertime between grades 12 and 13, I'm old enough that we went to grade 13. In fact, Timothy was old enough to go to grade 13. I went to France for a summer. My parents let me go to France with a friend for a whole summer, which was, I don't know how I ever convinced them to do that, but they did. And we spent time working together, and I was working picking peaches opposite this guy from a third-year university in the States who was a philosopher, who kept asking me why I believed. Well, I wasn't really sure I did believe, but I certainly wasn't going to give in to the argument. And discovered at the end of the summer that I actually did. And that sort of changed things. And so when I went off to university, I looked around. I was dragged off to an Anglican church. And I mean dragged off. I was going to some other churches, and this friend dragged me to an Anglican church, and it was matins and litany and procession. And I hated it. I thought, gee, this is paganism. But the music was good. And the friend dragged me back the next week, and it was a choral Eucharist, and it just clicked. And that friend never went back. And I kept on going. I was confirmed, and then a month after my confirmation, I found another friend who was in economics, and we were working on a problem together, and I looked at on his bed, there was a book, and said, what's that? He said, it's a course calendar for Huron College Faculty of Divinity, Faculty of Theology. And I said, oh, what are you doing with that? He said, well, I'm going to be an Anglican priest. And I said, oh, that's interesting, so am I. And I went, why did I say that? I'd never thought about that ever before that.
I know I am leaping along here,
Yep.
Colin, but you discovered that the Anglican Church was a place that nourished you. And you also discovered a young woman who was a Quaker. Ellen had a different spiritual path from you. Could you muse a little bit about that?
Ellen and I started to date before I decided I was going to be, that I was called into ordained ministry. She thought she was going to dating a lawyer. And then when I said casually in a group situation that I was going to be a priest, she said, well, enough of that. But it persisted. And the values that we had, the relations, the interests, our families were actually a lot alike. And they respected one another, and so there was that mutuality that grew up. We actually ended up, as I said, we had our divorce before we got married. We broke up for a year, or not quite a year. We broke up for a period of time and got re-engaged, and it's been 42 years. It'll be 43 years next year, next summer.
What would you say is one of the greatest pluses of Ellen in your work?
She keeps me grounded. She reminds me that the pomp and the circumstance are quite ephemeral, and that the heart is something much deeper. She reminds me also that in all of the chatter that actually happens in typical Anglican services, that there needs to be a deep silence out of which we can experience God. She's enormously supportive, and she is a phenomenal listener. And so she will listen in on conversations and tell me all the things I missed.
So, Colin, we're running out of time, and I have a few more questions. The next one was about some important aspects of your ministry, so I'm just going to list them, and I'm sorry, but if you just pick one and just speak to it. The first one is the changing role of lay leadership, baptismal renewal, Crucio, Logos, congregational development, the development of the lay pastoral associate. I mean, that's a lot there, but is there one that appeals to you at this moment?
For a bishop, I'm going to say the baptismal ministry. The renewal of baptism that began to take place in the 1970s has really reshaped the church, hugely reshaped the church, because what it's moved is, it has moved us from being a priest-centered, and we still are, but a priest-centered church to a church that's centered on baptismal ministry. We are called together into the life of the church. We all have ministry because of our baptism, and that has reshaped how we think of our engagement as a church in the world, whether it's from engagement with the environment to the love and service of other people, to participation in leadership, to how we worship together. It's been a sea change.
And would you also speak briefly to the mediating role that Canada's church will be playing or can play in the world?
Canada is, in terms of politically, Canada is a small power, a middle power, and it has politically, nationally, it has that role because it brings people from all over the world into Canada. Everybody is here. This is a microcosm of the world, and the way that we have learned how to be as Canadians, people who have to reconcile, have to compromise, have to struggle together. I think the fact that we're a cold country, and when immigrants came, they had to depend on their neighbor regardless of whether their neighbor was actually like them or not, because they wouldn't survive the winter without their neighbors. So Protestants and Catholics and Methodists and Anglicans, God forbid, actually had to work together, talk to each other, share things. And so that's actually reflected in the Anglican Church and our engagement abroad. We certainly are on the more liberal stream of the church, but we have the ability to make connections. We're not a superpower. And so we have no capacity to send missiles to destroy anybody else. We actually need one another. And so we have provided that mediating role. And because we have such a long experience of intercultural, multicultural working together, I think that gives us an opportunity to provide that sort of leadership in the rest of the communion. And we have done that. Like, we are so overrepresented in the leadership roles in intercommunion elements that it's hard to, we are so much overrepresented there because we are able to do it, and we're willing to do it, and we have the capacity to do it.
The church in general sometimes seems to be challenged constantly as a vibrant and vital part of our world. What is your great hope?
The great hope is that this is God's church. This is Jesus' church. It's not our church. And if I look historically, the church has been in just dreadful circumstances that you would never imagine that it would survive historically. It's been in huge tension before. This is new in our lifetime, but it's not new historically. And the hope is that as I look back at that history of God's faithfulness in the past, not to hanker after that a glorious past that used to be, because actually there never was a glorious past that used to be. It's all nostalgia. But what's back there is that foundation of God's faithfulness that is present today and is present into God's future. And we need to trust God.
Could I take 5 more minutes? Could I have permission for 5 more minutes? Okay. You are frank and generous, Colin, but I'm going to ask you to keep on being generous now. I'm going to ask you 10 quick questions.
Okay.
That require quick answers. When were you first on stage and why?
First on stage was when I was about 8 years old, and there was a town event, and I had to be a fashion model for clothes in my father's store, including lifting up my pant leg and showing the long underwear. And everybody laughed then too.
What is your biggest success in the kitchen?
Oh, that's hard to. I love cooking, and I could tell you the biggest failure, but the biggest success. Every New Year's Day, I cook dinner for about 20 people after being in the levee line for 3 hours.
If you could be any age again, what age would that be?
Again, I'm looking forward to the next age that I'm going to be. Certainly not teenager. I don't know. I like what I'm doing right now. I'd be 66 again. Or 60, I'm almost 66, 65.
Is there anything that drives you crazy?
Yes.
Next question.
Those telephone calls that you get in the middle of the night and saying, I have my basement is my basement is full. What are you going to do about it?
Who is a hero for you?
Oh, I have all sorts. I never have had one hero. I've had a whole lot of heroes. Heroes for me have been mentors, and I have had a huge number of mentors, several of whom are here tonight. Michael Bedford-Jones is a mentor. Doug Blackwell was a mentor. Terry Finley was a mentor. Judy Reedy was a mentor. So ordinary people who live extraordinarily and invite you into where the things that they have expertise in and allow you, incompetent as you are, to rise to it.
If you and Ellen go on holiday, do you tell people you meet what you do?
Not if I can help it.
Where in this world, now you've done a lot of traveling, but is there anywhere you would love to go to that you've never been to before?
New Zealand and Australia.
Talk about being a grandfather.
It's lovely. It's so much easier. I've always told the joke that the parents and the grandchildren and grandparents get along so well because they have a common enemy.
What will you really miss in the next chapter?
What I'll really miss is the opportunity to actually meet people on a. I will continue to be able to meet people, but that the privilege of being in the role of Bishop of Toronto is that you get to meet everybody, from the guy who is schizophrenic and is screaming at a blade of grass in the cathedral grounds, but is just Fred is a lovely person, to the Queen, and everybody in between. And just that capacity to mingle, not with one group of people, but with this range of people. And I will still be able to do that, but not to the same degree.
And what takes your breath away in this world?
Just the wonder of creation, the wonder of the diversity of people, the giftedness of people that are right in front of you. I mean, there are huge, wonderful, gifted people everywhere, but the gifted people who are right in front of you, who are in this room, takes my breath away.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Archbishop Colin Johnson.
Thank you.